Talk 49. 49. 49.
Marty Siwy has a passion for cemeteries and graveyards. Marty Siwy, where did this passion come from?
I've no idea. I've always enjoyed them. And it could be because when I was at school, first school, 5 to 12, there was a very big cemetery next door to the school, and the quickest way to get to the bus stop was to go through it. And it was nicely downhill, so we used to run down the cemetery and jump across the graves and so on and so forth on our way to the bus stop. Whether this was my first interest, I don't know, but it was great fun. And now they're just wonderful places to be because they've got fascinating gravestones. They're usually quiet, and the other people wandering around are very often worth watching because you get very funny people in graveyards.
You get very funny people. You've travelled a lot and you've visited graveyards, cemeteries on your travels. How do cemeteries, graveyards reflect the cultures of the countries they're in?
A bit difficult to say. I haven't been to that many. And in Europe, pretty much at first glance, they're all more or less the same. And military cemeteries are the same wherever you go. Rows and rows and rows of either white stones or white crosses, all exactly the same size and in neat and tidy rows. But that's, I think, anywhere in the world. Cemeteries here are good value because the Austrians are very keen on keeping their graves in good condition and keeping in with their dead relatives. I can remember when I very first came here, that's over 50 years ago, being told on a Sunday afternoon to go to the Zentralfriedhof because it was such fun. A sentence I didn't understand. But somebody said, no, go there, there's all the old ladies having picnics. So I went. It was November, so it was grey and cold, it wasn't raining. And whoever it was quite right. Every second grave had a little old, and Vienna did little old ladies in those days, they've died out now, all in their grey and brown, all with hats on, all with those straight coats with no belts and no waistlines, like a lot of really old bags. And when I got there in the middle of the afternoon, they'd mostly finished polishing their gravestones and cleaning them up. And whoever it was quite right. They were sitting down on hubby's grave and getting out their Semmel and Wurst and whatever, and chatting to the old lady on the next grave, and they were all having a wonderful time.
So in this sense, cemeteries are a place for celebration as well.
Oh yes, I think so. I mean, a normal burial is a celebration, isn't it? It's a celebration of the person's life. And depending on what your religious beliefs are, it's either a celebration of probably a celebration of they've got where they were going to go, whatever you believe.
Why are war graves such sad places?
Mainly because all the people in them are so young, or the vast majority. I remember going to Arlington in the middle of the Vietnam War and seeing these fields of white crosses, and naturally they're all roughly in their 20s. And it moved me, but not nearly as much as when 10 years later I did a tour of Belgium and northern France and went to a lot of the cemeteries from the First World War. And that really is very, very moving, because the vast majority are 18. They joined the army and were killed within 6 months. And then you get quite a lot who were 16 and 17 who'd snuck in by cheating and also got killed in the first couple of weeks. And this really was a very emotional, particularly if you were brought up on the First World War as I was, because my mother had lived through it and it was very important to her, and so it was thrust down my throat all my childhood. I think this had a stronger effect. Also, my mother worked for the War Graves Commission when she was 18 in 1920. She started working for them, but she said after 6 months she just couldn't take it anymore and she had to get a different job. It was just too much and still too close.
Aren't war graves the best protest against war?
They probably would be if more people went to see them, but I think very few people do, and the people who do are always over fighting age and such.
Okay. Why are cemeteries, graveyards, essential for learning about our past?
I don't know if they're essential. I mean, war graveyards teach you, bring home to you a war that probably affected your country or affected the country you happen to be in at the moment. But otherwise, teaching you about your past, I don't know. You find jobs that people did that don't exist anymore, but most graveyards aren't really legible or studyable beyond about 100 years back. If you go to an English churchyard, you'll be lucky if you can read a gravestone before about 1880. So they don't teach you much, they're just grey stones with some scratchy marks on them, but until you work out what the writing was back then, it's a bit difficult. One that teaches you about the present is the Happy Graveyard in Romania. That's absolutely wonderful. Not gravestones, the grave markers are all wood, and they'd always had wooden crosses on their graves, and the local carpenter always made them. And sometime in the late 30s, I think it was just before the Second World War, the carpenter was told to make a cross for whoever it was who just died, all right, after supper. He started making and he thought, God, this is boring. Been doing this for all this time. Name, birth dates, God bless. And this man had cows. So he drew a little picture of the man and the cows beside his date. Wondered if he'd lose his job. But in fact, the widow was very pleased and everybody else thought it was rather funny. So he started doing little pictures and carvings for everybody. And now it's a whole graveyard. Most of the crosses are painted basically blue. And they've got little models and little pictures. They've got housewives with stoves cooking. They've got little stories about the people, but since it's in Romania, and I can't tell you what was written about them. But they've got one prostitute who died plying her trade, and she's shown on her gravestone doing what she did best.
Brilliant little story. We live in Vienna, you live in Vienna, Marty. What's your favourite graveyard cemetery here, if one can say that?
Kahlenberg.
Why
Definitely.
Kahlenberg?
Because it's tiny. It's got about a dozen graves. Half of them you can't really see anymore. Some of them are still used. The monks who live in, work, whatever the word is, the church on the Kahlenberg, I forget who they are, Restitution, or anyway, I forget what their order's called, but something like that. They're still buried in this cemetery. And for some reason, Cardinal Ungar, who died 20 years ago, was also buried in there. So you've got one very modern grave, and there's an even more modern one from some not religious person, but normal person. I can't remember who he is. But it's very, very quiet. There's never anybody there. It's kept in good enough condition that you can see the graves and it's not overgrown, but it's still got a lovely atmosphere. And the best grave in it is Carolina Traunwieser, I think, she died of TB, I think, and was the prettiest girl at the Congress of Vienna. She was 17 when she died.
17 when she died?
17 when she died, in the middle of the Congress of Vienna.
Marty, when you go into what for you is a new cemetery, graveyard, what do you expect to discover? What do you expect to find?
I expect to find graves. But you do get different. I was in one in London in the spring, where I hadn't been before. Terribly overgrown, and now sort of officially a park. So it's full of overgrown graves and things, and people walking their dogs and runners going through, but it's still very, very peaceful and has a definite cemetery atmosphere. And there's a grave marker. I don't think anybody's buried there, from a woman mourning her two sons who were both in their 20s. And then a little bit next to it, there's a little note from her saying, "Will whoever keeps stealing the flowers I put here, please stop it, they are for my sons." And I find this a very touching little normality of life in a cemetery.
Is this something very British, very English, maybe, not taking care of cemeteries?
Yes, I think so. Certainly the cemeteries here, whether it's the Zentralfriedhof or some little tiny churchyard out in the country, are all very, very well kept. And I think most of the, except of course, I think they do it on purpose, the old Jewish cemetery in Prague, which on purpose is left that the stones all lean all against each other all over the place, and that's got a different atmosphere. But I think they do that on purpose to make it a tourist attraction. Otherwise, most of them are in Paris, Père Lachaise. The graves are so close together they can't get overgrown because each stone is touching the next stone. There's no room for a wisp of ivy between them. Saves them a lot of work.
Keeping cemeteries in good order, is this respect for those who have gone before, or is it
municipal tidiness?
Or could you say, it's where we would rather end up, in somewhere nice and well kept?
I think the feeling that you're going to be looked after is quite. I mean, obviously, once you're there, you don't know or care, but beforehand, I think the feeling that your grass is going to be mown and people are going to be able to read your stone, I think, is quite comforting. If you want that. Nowadays, the in thing is to have a tree burial or a wood burial, where they put your name on purpose on something that's going to wash away within a short time, and then you're gone.
And we're gone anyway. What a great place to finish. Marty, what is the future for graveyards? We're becoming more and more and more alternatives.
You mean we're going to take up too much space? Mm-hmm. No, I don't think so, because now cremation is very, very in. I think in most countries. Okay, the Muslims don't cremate, do they? And the Jews don't. But certainly, let's narrow it down to Christians. Cremation is very popular. And as I say, now it's also then, instead of being put in a grave in a cemetery, it's becoming fashionable to be put under a tree in the woods. And up until about 3 or 4 years ago, Vienna had 2 nature cemeteries, or whatever they call them, where you're buried in the woods, one in Purkersdorf and one in Mauerbach. And now you can have a natural burial in the Zentralfriedhof, in Kahlenberg, I think in a whole lot of the municipal cemeteries. They've all got a tree somewhere. And then you're put in a bio-urn, which is going to dissolve anyhow. You're not taking up any space at all. Gone.
How interesting. Mm-hmm. And gone. We're gone. We're all going to be gone one day. Where are you going to spend eternity?
You mean my body?
Yes,
Where the rest of us is going to spend it, we won't discuss.
Okay, but we'll find out.
I shall be cremated, and probably my ashes will go into the family graveyard, along with all my in-laws and my husband. But I suppose I really shan't care by that point. Whatever the children do with it, they can do. But I don't want to be buried. There's no reason taking up space. And also, I don't want a coffin, although the city of Vienna will insist on it. I think it's a total waste of wood, and a body bag would do nicely. And also, think of the cost of the cremation.
Think of the cost of the cremation. What?
Well, why burn a coffin? You've used it for half an hour, and I don't know how much electricity it takes to burn it, but it's ridiculous. If you're burnt in a cotton bag or something, then it must take quarter the time and quarter the energy. I'm green.
Very, very expensive firewood.
Yes. Trees being cut down just so they can be burnt immediately, and not even to warm somebody or to cook something, which has some logic to it. No, I think I'm very anti-coffin.
Anti-coffin. What a great place to finish. Marty Siwy, thank you for talking to Talk 49.
Talk 49.